Welcome back to another video lecture for AP US History. This time we're going to take a look at the lead up to the home front and the end of World War II for American history. So let's start off here. World War II to me is one of those watershed moments in United States history, and it really is extremely important. Why? Two reasons. One has to do with our foreign leadership and the other with our internal demographic movements. Ooh, big word. What do I mean by demographic? That means people moving around within the country. So World War II is so essential. The United States is going to start at the beginning of this war being sort of a neutral, isolationist country, but it's going to move into being an interventionist country and one that is sort of a global leader from here on out. Internally in the country, there are huge demographic movements during the home front that changes up the way racial and gender relationships take place in the country from here on out. In fact, this really kind of sets us up for everything else we're going to study about in class. I always like to say that World War II is really the beginning of American history, which I know for many of you history buffs out there, you're like, no, that is like blasphemous. And I get it. It's so important to study the American Revolution, the Constitution, the Civil War, so forth. But really, our modern history is so shaped by what happens with World War II and after. So this is really pretty essential. So here's my thesis. World War II launches America into a superpower leader status while it exposes internally gender and racial inequalities that sets us up for the 1950s and 1960s. So let's start off first with foreign policy, especially in what are called the interwar years. So that's between World War I and World War II. So this is the time when the Great Depression has happened. Under Franklin Roosevelt, America settles into sort of an isolationist phase in our foreign policy. In that isolationist phase, that's isolationist in military terms, not in economic terms. We are doing trade with the rest of the world. With Latin America, very important, we established something called the Good Neighbor Policy. What was that? Well, there was a lot of criticism at the time for our imperialism within Latin America. Remember what had happened during the Spanish-American War. There were also something called the Banana Republic Wars. What were those? That was at the beginning of the century. American troops oftentimes intervened in Latin American countries, and so we wanted to establish a better reputation. So what we did was we established what are called reciprocal trade agreements. That meant lowering tariffs so there'd be more trade back and forth in Latin America. Also, Franklin Roosevelt established that by the early 1940s, the Philippines would get their freedom. So remember, we had taken over the Philippines in the Spanish-American War. Now we were going to set them free and allow them to have their own local sovereignty. Then in the late 1930s, there is a civil war that takes place in Spain between the Republicans and the Nationalists. Okay, who were these guys? Well, basically it was fascism in Spain against Republicans, people who wanted a democratic republic. Franklin Roosevelt stays out of this, and in fact the fascist leader who will win, Francisco Franco, was so praising of Roosevelt, he said, Roosevelt is a gentleman. Roosevelt never really liked that afterwards. In fact, he saw that as sort of the turning point for him. And that really gets into what Roosevelt realizes by 1939. He realizes America has to get involved in World War II. So he starts doing this slowly. For example, he does a policy called Lend-Lease, where basically the British can come and they can borrow naval battleships. They can borrow tanks from America. There's also cash and carry. Britain can basically be loaned money to build up their industrial force. And finally, by 1940, Roosevelt is establishing a voluntary force to go over to Europe. Now, you're probably wondering, how is any of this keeping us out of the war? It sure sounds like it's getting us involved in the war. In fact, the critics of Roosevelt said the same thing at the time. Well, Roosevelt was trying to get us in. He kind of realized we had to get into this war at some point. And of course, that leads into our eventual involvement. So that's number two here, our involvement in this war. We get involved because of what happens at Pearl Harbor, but Roosevelt realized that we were kind of headed in this direction. At the time, there had been a whole bunch of negotiations with Japan over what they were doing in China. Eventually, there was the passage of what was called the Atlantic Charter, in which both Roosevelt and Winston Churchill made a statement in favor of human rights and trade. Remember, this goes back to the open door policy for America and China. The United States then freezes Japanese funds and also will no longer do any oil trade with Japan. That was when Japan basically closed down negotiations because they needed that oil trade. And they thought, if we can do a quick attack on America, they're just not ready for war, they'll let go of this whole oil trade embargo and that will get things going again. Well, that doesn't happen. After Pearl Harbor, there's so much anger in the country at that point, we join in the war. So once we enter into the war, what are our strategies? Well, there are really three. Okay, so the first one is our European theater of war, and that's called the African strategy. The African strategy was that the Soviet Union would fight against the Germans in the Eastern theater. We would come up with the British through Northern Africa, take out any of the allies that Germany had, so Italy, and then we would eventually attack from the West. This is very important because this actually creates the conditions for the Cold War. Joseph Stalin always believed that we did this in order to cause the Germans and the Soviets just to take each other out, and that this would delay us getting into the war full on in the European theater. There's no evidence for that was the case, but it does create that paranoia and suspicion on Stalin's part. In the Pacific, originally after Pearl Harbor, we attacked Japan head-on, and that did not go well for the first 6 months. In fact, General MacArthur, who was in the Philippines, had to leave, and he eventually said, we are going to come back. We are going to win this. And when he left, the Japanese did something called the Bataan Death March, where they took American soldiers and other Filipinos and marched them from the southern part of the island to the northern part of the island. So many people died in this horrible march up to a POW camp. Island hopping came out of this. And the idea of island hopping was that instead of attacking Japan straight up, we would attack all of their allies and all of their satellites. So all the islands that they had out in that area that allowed them to have like Air Force bases. We would attack all those areas because they were smaller and harder to defend, and then eventually Japan would be defenseless and we could attack them head on. So what is the third strategy? Well, the third strategy is not really a strategy so much as it is what was going on in the home front, and that is the industrial buildup of war. And that was probably, Japan's biggest mistake on getting us involved in the war. We had such a huge, massive industrial complex that allowed us, once it got going, to really just endlessly produce war materials. And unlike in Europe, we didn't have to worry about constant bombing from the air from our opponents. So that leads into the home front, because that's really important. So what goes on with this industrial home front? Well, there's a movement from rural areas into urban centers, especially African Americans are moving into the Great Migration up north. Women are being incentivized to come into factories as men are no longer around. There's the big, probably have heard about it or seen it at some point, there's big propaganda posters of Rosie the Riveter. These are women who are coming into the factories and working. There was also the Bracero program, where the American government incentivized Mexican immigration to come and harvest crops while farmers were off fighting in the war. This is all really important because this is going to set up the foundation eventually for the civil rights and feminist movement of the 1950s. How so? African Americans move into urban centers. They are no longer in really dense numbers in the South. There's a lot more freedom in the North. Don't get me wrong, there's still tons of racism and segregation by fact up in the North, but this eventually established more free spaces for African Americans to assemble, to get their education, and to eventually organize and to fight back against racism. For women entering into the factory, the eventual question is going to come, okay, wait a minute, if we as women are made so fragile and we can't handle factory work, why are we doing so well right now in doing this? And for Mexican labor, what's so important is that there's a pattern that's going to be established here of immigration from Mexico into America, back into Mexico, and that's going to set up our immigration patterns in the long term. One last thing that's important about the home front, the U.S. spent massive amounts of money on the economy to get the economy going and to make sure we'd have enough for military. This became known what was called as military Keynesianism. So remember, we talked in the Great Depression about how important to Keynes it was that you spend money during a depression. Well, here they did it. They did it on massive scales in order to get a wartime economy going, and it essentially worked. Unemployment went all the way from the 9% that we were at the end of the Great Depression in 1940 down to basically 1%, and that basically ended the Great Depression. Okay, so now we're going to jump to the end of the war. I know, you're so angry. You're like, Zucker, I waited all year for this. We were going to talk about World War II, right? Well, it's not the way we really handle it here. We talk not so much about battles here, but about the general social, economic, and political effects. So, sorry, I know I disappointed you. You can always go check out things on the History Channel about World War II. Anyways, back to this. In 1940, right after 1941, Franklin Roosevelt set up what was called the Manhattan Project. One of the great benefits for us, horrible tragedy here, the Jewish Holocaust. One of the great benefits, though, many of the Jewish refugees came here to the United States, and many of them were incredible scientists. And they began working for our administration, and FDR set up many of them to go, and along with a lot of other scientists, they went and they worked and they developed the nuclear bomb project, the Manhattan Project. Now, here's the thing that's important about that. We informed the British about the project, but not the Soviets. Why didn't we do this? Because we saw the upcoming Cold War, and we did not want the Soviets knowing about the nuclear bomb. Joseph Stalin, however, had spies in the Manhattan Project, so he knew about it, which is going to cause a lot of paranoia and suspicion. Why weren't we informing our ally, during the war? Then in the 1940s, we do the D-Day invasion. So remember, we were doing North Africa. Eventually, we got to a point where we were able to invade at Normandy. And with the D-Day invasion, we removed the pressure from the Soviets. We led an invasion that went through France into Germany. Germany put up one last attempt. They forced all of their soldiers into one area in what's called the Battle of the Bulge, where this huge amount of German forces pushed back the American and British forces. But they were so depleted at that point, all it was this small, intense area. We quickly pushed them back into Germany. The Russians then came in from the east, the US from the west. In 1945, we met in Berlin. And that ends World War II, but sets the conditions for the Cold War. So in this time, we have two huge conferences I want you to remember. One is the Yalta Conference, in which the US and the Soviet Union promised to break up Europe. The United States would get sort of like overall supervision over Western Europe. Russia would get supervision over Eastern Europe. Stalin promised that there would be free elections in Eastern Europe in 1 year. That's not going to happen. Then there was the Potsdam Conference. Now at this point, Franklin Roosevelt had died, and his vice president, Harry Truman, became president. He hated Joseph Stalin. They were working through strategies on how to invade into Japan when somebody pulled Truman aside and said, hey, guess what? We just successfully tested the nuclear bomb out in New Mexico. So at that point, Truman goes ahead and he allows for the bombing of Hiroshima on August 6th and then Nagasaki on August 9th. So the big question is, why did we do this? What was the real purpose behind it? We're going to take a look at that this week. So the other big event that I want to leave you with is the Bretton Woods Conference, which takes place in Vermont at the end of the war, around 1944, around the end of the war. And here, the economics of post-war are going to be established. The United States, along with its allies, will establish the IMF and the World Bank. The IMF is the International Monetary Fund, and they set the rules of the economy. The World Bank provides for loans, especially to developing world economies. So what was the idea here? The idea was to set up rules for a marketplace in the world, and if you follow those rules, the World Bank will give you loans. So what are these rules? The rules are the following. Number 1, fight inflation. Number 2, lower tariffs. And number 3, industrialize. So again, fight inflation, lower tariffs, industrialize. If you do those things, the World Bank gives you loans to do them. Why are we doing this? To create an international economy that will fight back against things like the Great Depression. Okay, here are your takeaways. Number 1, World War II was a watershed moment for the United States. Why? Because we went from a country that caused the Great Depression to one of global leadership. Okay, number 2, the home front experienced dramatic changes in movements of minorities and women into the public sphere. And number 3, the Americans now are going to hold a monopoly of nuclear weapons, and that sets up our Cold War and the arms race. Okay, see you in class or online.